So, for responsible data use, we need four things, which are laid out on this slide here. The first one really is ethical leadership, and that kind of goes across the board as something that's really important. There also needs to be an increased access to trainings and resources, such as this one, which is great. I feel like I'm happy to see everybody here. Um, but then two big parts of responsible data use are developing a set of values for your organization and data principles, and then linking those to data governance systems, policies, and structures. And those two pieces are what we're going to dive into today throughout the webinar. So we will have lots of information for you all. And just a little bit about some of the objectives, like what we're hoping all of you to walk away with, and ourselves too, because we're constantly learning during these webinars. But we are hoping to share some information about how you can recognize the risks, limitations, and benefits of our data work. Also learning about how to develop data principles for our organization so that they can serve as a framework to guide responsible data practices. We're also going to dive into that data governance piece, which I mentioned earlier. It's a little bit jargony, but we're going to get into it. Taylor's going to do a great job describing the key aspects. And then we're going to have some time throughout the webinar to reflect and share and make sure we're absorbing some of the learnings that we're having.
So we want to talk through the benefits and limitations of risks before we go into responsible data practices, because that's sort of the foundation of like why is it important to think about responsible data practices. And we like to think about data really as a tool. So data can be used for good, but data can also cause considerable harm to individuals and communities. And a lot of our existing systems were built based on inequitable practices and power structures. And so if we're not examining how these structures and historical context impact our data work, we're not only upholding a flawed status quo, right? But we're also missing key insights, right? Like some folks mentioned, like who are we collecting it from? In the green box is a lot of the benefits of using data, and we won't go through that because I think a lot of us are familiar with those. That's why we're excited to be here. The risks of using data, we covered a lot of these in your comments. So privacy disclosure, that's pretty self-explanatory. A lot of times that can be unintentional, right? We can leave our folder at the cafe or our backpack at the cafe if it's not locked. We could have a security breach. So lots of different privacy issues. Data can cause harm, and that could include, maybe providing personal information to caseworkers, service providers, teachers, law enforcement, anybody in positions of power that could lead to a loss or a reduction of supports. It could lead to biased treatments, right? So what data is entered in someone's medical record, and how do the providers then perceive of the client in front of them? And it also can lead to punitive action, right? So home visitors who are working with families, the data that they're collecting can be used to support them in a potential child welfare situation, but it also could be used against them. So how could data be misused or misrepresented in findings? Again, this happens in a variety of ways, but an important question to ask, especially in the nonprofit world, is, are we only telling part of the story, right? So continually reporting on the negative outcomes or the disparities, especially of certain populations, can actually feed into stereotypes and have impacts on the larger narratives about communities. So thinking about, are we only reporting on the barriers and failing to highlight the successes and assets of the communities that we're working with? This last one, what you measure is what you incentivize. So our programs are often multifaceted, and the things that we decide to measure can have a lot of impact and power in terms of how our staff are thinking about the work and how our partners are thinking about the work. Sometimes there are things that are easier to measure than others. So one example might be recidivism, right? On one hand, it's a common metric. There's a lot of existing data about it. That means it's probably a little less money to to track it. And it's really helpful because we can compare recidivism for one program to another pretty easily. But on the other hand, if you're working with recently incarcerated individuals, there are other aspects of their well-being and health that might matter just as much about, to them as whether they're arrested again. Like, how are they supporting their family? How are they maintaining connection and bond with their community outside of their incarcerated setting? So, and also whether someone is arrested or not is also impacted by external factors, right? How concentrated are the arrest efforts in that community, and are those arrest efforts targeted towards certain communities? Those kinds of things are outside of a program's control. And so, having an easy metric like recidivism, it might be really great for some things, but there's risks in shifting our attention to one aspect of a person's experience and not seeing the bigger picture. And that kind of leads next into limitations and biases of data. So we need to understand and examine what data can and cannot do, and also examine the biases we bring to working with data. We talk a lot about data-driven decision-making, right? Data doesn't actually make the decisions for you. It's a tool. It gets you so far, and it's really important to pay attention to who is using the data and what their motivations and potential biases might be. The questions in the blue box are really helpful considerations, especially when using data maybe that you haven't actually been the primary collector of. Maybe you're using additional data sets. But wrestling with potential bias is a really important question to have on your teams, whether it's your data team or your programmatic team. What assumptions are you and others bringing to the table? Someone, I think, Noah, you pointed out, like, whose data are you collecting and whose data are you not collecting, right? So we talk about selection bias, where individuals represented in the data do not necessarily represent the entire population. So if you only have information about people who are opting in to provide their data, what might you be missing from the folks who aren't opting in? How are data being used to support our already existing beliefs and ideas? That's something we call confirmation bias. And then, using information, this is a little bit touched on when I was talking about the recidivism, using information that is most readily available rather than the information that might be fully representative. Another way this can happen is, like, if you're just looking at a certain time period of data, maybe a broader historical context would give you different perspectives on patterns and help you draw different conclusions. Great. Any questions about benefits, risks, limitations, biases? Okay. Well, we'll move on to responsible data practices and data principles. So yes, all of that, the risks, the limitations, that's why it's really important. We want to be really thoughtful about how to have responsible data practices within our own and organizational work. One way we like to think about responsible data practices is being able to think through the decisions and practices you're using throughout the entire data life cycle. So it's obviously really important to think about some of these upfront, all the different steps along the way, from the planning and the risk assessment, all the way through to what do you do with the data when your project is ended? How do you dispose of it responsibly? One tool that we really like, that's also linked in our resources slide at the end, is called the data biography template, and it comes from a website called We All Count. And it just has it's a spreadsheet, and it just helps you ask question after question based on where you are in that data life cycle. It's really helpful. So next slide. So we often think about responsible data practices as the things that we do, the activities, how we share and collect sensitive data, data privacy, etc. And we also might have several organizational considerations, right? We want to comply with regulations. Someone said, HIPAA, like, yeah, we need to comply with regulations. And we want to be able to consider what our data can and cannot do for us, what questions they're answering. In order for our practices, so the things here above the water, to be responsive and equitable, it's also really necessary to dive a little bit deeper and connect with our values and commitment to use data in a way that supports justice rather than just reinforcing structural inequities. And so this is where data principles come in. So data principles are really helpful. They are, when you're done with them, they are a final framework to help you answer the questions and help you guide when responding to data opportunities and risks in a consistent manner, right? So you have the work that you're doing now, but there's always going to be new and emerging things that are coming up. And so having that framework really helpful. But the process itself of drafting these principles with your team, reflecting and discussing your values and commitments, that itself is also really valuable too. And during the process, we can acknowledge the power dynamics and systemic oppression that's inherent in the work that we're doing. So one example is like, whose priorities are reflected in our data work? Are we collecting data because that is what is meaningful to our funder, or is the data meaningful to us or to our communities? Reflecting on the positionality and potential bias that exists within the data. So, we talked a little bit about bias before, but also who is collecting the data, who's interpreting the data. Are those folks that have understanding of the communities that they're working with? Are they members of the community that they're working with? Engaging curiously with the data and reflecting on it mindfully. So, really ensuring that populations are being counted and heard with dignity and respect. And then, using the precautionary principle. So thinking about privacy and opportunities to reduce harm throughout the data life cycle. And there is we'll get to this too. There's a lot of resources that are in the slides. And a lot of this that we borrowed from comes from a project in LA that worked with youth that had recently been incarcerated. So, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I will pass it off to Roxanne to talk about the process of actually drafting the data principles.
Hi again, everybody. Thanks, Lizzie. So we just talked a little bit about like the why we want to create data principles, why it's important to have them for our organizations. And in the following slides, I'm going to talk through a little bit about like the how of how you want to draft data principles and the steps that we can take when we're drafting up appropriate data principles that work for our specific like organizational needs, maybe even our personal needs, and then the populations that we work with, our partners, all of that. So I'm not going to dive into this slide here because we're going to get into it in the upcoming slides, but this will just be for reference when we send out the webinar afterwards. So you can go to the next slide. So in the first step, we want to take the time to map out the potential risks at each stage of the data cycle. And we already spoke earlier about the risks and limitations associated with data, and that was somewhat generally speaking. And then we also, Lizzie talked about the responsible data life cycle. And so this step really brings those two pieces together. You can kind of merge those ideas and specifically map out the risks that our data holds at our organizations at each step of the process. So from collection to processing all the way to using the data. And we have some examples here, such as during collection, you can have duplication and inconsistencies. In processing, you can have insufficient security provisions, so data could be leaked, etc. So we just have some examples there, but we really want, in this step, we're really thinking about the risks that the data that we use at our organizations have during each step of the data cycle. It's not going to be the same for every organization. It's not going to be the same for every step or even maybe every program, but just really thinking through that piece so that we can acknowledge and identify the risks and hopefully put some things in place that can mitigate those risks for us. So you can go to the next slide. Before I move on to step 2, we wanted to pause and address this critical question, which is related to data collection from the previous slide and from the data lifecycle. And we really want folks to remember that data is only beneficial when it's used and acted upon. So it can be really tempting to collect as much data as possible so that we can have all the information at the end of our fingertips. But we really want to be clear about what data is essential to the project, to your program, to our organizations, because there are times where it's possible to procure more data than is essential for the questions you're asking. But in this step, it's like a little half step here. We really want you to consider the ethical, logistical, and legal implications for acquiring that data. And we know this can be hard to do. This is something that we at CORE try to do. And it is challenging to not over collect, but it's important to stop or at least pause and think this piece through. And as you're drafting up your data principles and going through this whole process, really thinking about like how much data do we need? What elements will we use for what purposes? Thinking through some of those questions in that blue box there. How will data elements be linked or combined? Can we remove some data that we're planning on collecting because it's not necessary? So just thinking through those pieces. You can go to the next slide. So step 2 is engaging stakeholders. And if you've been to a webinar with us before or have worked with us before, you've probably heard us mention stakeholder engagement at least once. And here it is again, it's not going anywhere, but we really just want to make sure that when we're drafting our data principles, we're engaging stakeholders and consulting the populations that we work with regularly. This is really a vital step as we draft up the data principles, because even though the data principles are for our organizations and for our personal uses, the data we collect still has impact and implications for others around us. So, be it other organizations or the populations we serve. So that's why when you're going through this process, you really need to bring in stakeholders, have that conversation with them, because even though the principles, as I said, are for our own internal use and our organizations, the data we collect still has implications outside of our organization. So we want to make sure people are informed, they're consulted, that they feel like they're collaborating with us, and that helps to empower as well. So you can go to the next slide. So step 3, when we're drafting up our data principles, this feels like a pretty simple step, but there's a couple layers to it. When we're drafting up data principles, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can review and utilize resources that other organizations have created. And like Lizzie mentioned, we have a ton of resources at the end of the webinar. So reviewing what's already out there can just kind of like get ideas flowing around what our organizational data principles could be. Because sometimes people are like, I don't even know where to start, but there's lots of resources out there. You could also take some time to talk with your partners and other organizations that you work with regularly and see if they have data principles. And you can try to align yourself or your principles with those of like-minded organizations doing similar work. You don't have to like copy word for word exactly what someone else has written down for their data principles, but again, it can kind of just help get some ideas flowing. And it can just help continue that conversation of like engagement with others and making sure that you're not spending too much time reinventing something that's already been done. But, even though this step is just reviewing and scanning other resources, you want to pause again and make sure that whatever you're using from external resources, you're making sure it fits for you and your organization and then the populations that you serve as well. Because we don't want to just, copy and paste and have this set of principles that don't really resonate with the work that we do. So We can go to the next slide. So for step 4, of course, feels like the final step, but drafting your data principles. Um, and so once we draft our data principles, we want to, again, go back and vet them with our stakeholders. So continue to have that open conversation of, these are the principles that we feel like align with our organization. How do you all feel about this? Are there things we're missing? And just making sure that they resonate with the people that engage with our work and engage with us as an organization. And on the next slide, I'll dive into an example so you can see a little bit more what some data principles could be. But for each data principle that we have, you could have 3, 5, 10, however many your organization deems appropriate. You could write up an action that goes with that principle. So it kind of shows, the action shows what that principle looks like in like real life, like how your organization's taking steps to bring that principle to life in the work that you do. And once we've done that, once we have the principles drafted and some actions that are associated with the principle, those two things can help guide our data governance plan, which I'm not going to talk about right now because Taylor's going to dive into data governance in just a little bit. But this is, again, it seems like a simple step, just draft your data principles, but there's actually a lot of layers to it. There's considerations that you want to make. Again, thinking through some of those questions in that blue box can just help get your juices flowing and ideas going. And when you have conversations internally versus with external folks or other organizations you work with, it can really bring up some great principles that resonate with you and the folks that you work with. You can go to the next slide. So this is an example, and Lizzie mentioned it earlier. It's we borrowed a lot of information from them, but it's the Los Angeles Division of Youth Diversion and Development, and they drafted up their data principles. On the left-hand side, you can see that's like their main statement about their commitment to the ethical use of data. I'm not going to read through it, but when we share these slides, you'll be able to read through it on your own. But on the right-hand side, we have the list of principles and an associated action. And again, the action really shows how your organization will convey the principles through your work and efforts. So like for the first one here, the first principle, it says respect youth's ownership of data. But like, what does that really mean? So the action shows how you can do that through the work that you do. And here they have written, clearly communicate to participating youth the potential uses and risks associated with their data. So it's just showing that the principle is actually having an action in the work that we do, and it makes it a little more concrete because sometimes principles can be a little bit like ethereal. And we just want to note that we condensed the LA Division of Youth principles for the purposes of this slide. There's a lot more information that they included, and they actually have more than one action per principle. So it's not like a one-to-one. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But again, we'll have the resources at the end of the webinar so you can dive in a little bit deeper to see what their whole set of principles and actions are. You can go to the next slide. Now we're going to do a little interactive time so that I can stop blabbing. But here's a scenario. I'll talk through it, and then we'll have some questions that'll pop up at the bottom. And feel free to answer either in the chat, or you're welcome to come off mute if you're comfortable doing that, whatever works for you. But your CBO works with houseless families. You are talking with a local CCO about a joint initiative to support 100 families to secure and maintain housing and increase access to healthcare. As part of the initiative, you will share your intake and assessment documentation through an online portal with the CCO so they can verify they are on Medicaid, pay for the family's housing costs, and monitor and evaluate the initiative. Another piece is that your housing navigators use both paper copies and tablets to collect data and communicate with families through work cell phones and email. So the first question is what are some potential benefits of this project, this collaboration? I'll wait for the answers to flood in. Anybody? Okay, so, oh, thanks, Lizzie. Sharing the data with healthcare might help individuals get needed healthcare. Increase social determinants of health for families. Yeah, I think both of those are good, that there's greater access for folks potentially, coming out of this, greater access to healthcare. All right. For time's sake, we'll go on to the next question, which is what are the potential risks that this project poses? Compromised data security. Cole says paper copies can be lost or thrown away, exposing data. Yep, definitely. I think that goes to Cheryl's comment. Sarah, survey burden. Yep, could have too much surveying of the population going on. Yep, definitely some risks. And I mean, for as many benefits as there are, there's potentially that many risks. So these are obviously just some examples. Carol says communication is hard. These methods may not reach all. Yeah, that's true. So making sure you're reaching the right populations, the folks that need the support. All right, so we'll go to the next question. You can feel free to keep answering in the chat, but what else would you want to discuss with your partners? So thinking about, like, you might want to discuss risk with them, the collection piece, processing. Lizzie says mitigating the risk, really taking the time to explain how data is going to be used during the consent process. That's a good opportunity to discuss that with your partners. You can take time to pause and think about that critical piece that I brought up earlier about, not over collecting, making sure that the data we collect is just what we need for this project. All right, and then lastly, again, for time's sake, so that Taylor has enough time to talk about all the important data governance stuff, which stakeholders should you consult? Clients, definitely. I think that's a very important group. Obviously, you're partnering with the CCO, so folks at the CCO. The navigators, definitely. Yep, they're the ones that are doing the data collection and working with the community. All right. That's great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you engaging there. I will pass it over to Taylor. If anyone has other ideas or questions, feel free to pop them in the chat.
Okay, so we have talked a lot about data principles, but now we get the fun opportunity to talk about data governance. You can see on the next slide that data governance has a definition here, but as the cartoon shows, like, it's always kind of a fuzzy thing. Everybody has their own definition for it and interpretation of what it means. A lot of people think that data governance should really fall to just like the IT folks, But really, data governance is a broad concept of ways that you're working toward ensuring data are secure, private, accurate, and usable. So in order to operationalize all of that, it involves taking actions. So you're dictating what actions people should be taking. And you're doing that through developing processes for them to follow. And then you're doing helping support the processes and the actions through getting technology on board at your organizations. And the technology, supports the data throughout the data lifecycle. Um, so the next slide we'll talk about why it's important. I think we all have a sense that um, there are sometimes like rules that we have to follow. But beyond that, it's important because as we've discussed earlier, like we have these like hopefully your data principles will be imbued with your values, and you really want to make sure that you're recognizing that the data are really about people, and we all care about people, and we want to be responsible to the people. So it does help increase your efficiency, productivity, accuracy, and being more reliable in your decision making. But also, really, with those principles of like protecting the privacy um, of the folks that you're collecting data on or reporting about. And then there's also the notion of the compliance, like the rules, and also making it easier to report. So there are some key aspects that we're going to talk about, and on the next slide, they're all sort of like boxed individually, and the way that it appears on the slide, you might think that they're mutually exclusive. Rest assured, they are not. Each of these really overlaps with each other, but we just to give you a sense of like what each one sort of is. We'll talk about them separately, but please, I'm not trying to suggest that none of these touch each other. They all are very much intertwined. So the first one is decision-making authority. So decision-making authority, like you're gonna need to have it both internally. So like any time you are coming up with policies or procedures for your own organization, but certainly if you are working with partner organizations, you're gonna want to make sure that you have a decision like governance around the decision making authority in those instances. So if you're wanting to create a shared database or just combine data, um, and you're working across organizations, like who's on point, who's going to be able to make decisions about who gets access to the data, how the data are used, and different considerations around the data once they're there. So anyone who touches the data throughout that data lifecycle really needs to recognize that they have a vital and intersecting role in overseeing the data governance. But there does need to be sort of that final authority and accountability piece, and just be super transparent and clear around what those decisions are and why they've been made. And some of that is going to be done, like you should have on the next slide, we're going to talk about sort of like policies and procedures. So data governance policies and procedures that your organization has, but also then for different, like what do you do when you are going to partner with other organizations? So having clear, well-documented, transparent policies and procedures are going to really help you figure out what to do, both so that you're in compliance with any regulations, but also like what happens when something goes wrong. Obviously, we'd like to believe that we're always perfect, but we're not. And there are definitely situations and circumstances where like there needs to be some kind of guidance for how the work is done, and then what happens when something goes wrong. So this can really you can have all sorts of different policies, and hopefully you already have a lot, but if there are always opportunities to think about maybe creating some more. I know certain policies are about like how data are reported or visualized are becoming a little bit more common across organizations, especially as pertain to any context or even equity statements that need to be made in conjunction with those visualizations. So maybe if you don't have something like that, that could be something that you could focus on. Whether there are any organizational rules or guidance around what you do with small numbers, like if you have to suppress small numbers before reporting on them for the protection of your communities. Even document retention policies are critical, both to have and to make sure that your staff are aware of. So what do you do? What are you supposed to do with those sticky notes that you write, clients' phone numbers on, or the notebook that you have where you're taking notes when you go on site visits? Like, are you just dropping those in the recycle bin, or are you shredding them? And should you be doing shredding if you're only doing recycling? And then even something like a secure email policy, whether your organization even has one, and if you know what it is and how to use it. So these policies sort of help comply with any regulations that exist, but also help protect and make sure that you're mitigating some of the risks that we've discussed earlier today. In a more specific way, data sharing on the next slide is sort of a very specific way to talk about policies. So data sharing agreements is a little bit more frequently, if you are engaging with other partner organizations, you'll have to figure out a data sharing agreement. Or even if you're trying to receive an external data source, the folks who own the data hopefully will make you come up with a data use agreement or a data sharing agreement. And so these help really define the legal authorities that allow you to use the data, who can see the data, who can see what level of data, as well as like the outcomes of the reporting of the data. So if you are getting access, what are the regulations around you sort of sharing those back out? Can they be individual level, or do they have to be aggregated? And so there are already a lot of really well-known federal regulations like HIPAA, somebody said earlier, FERPA, if you're working with student education data. But those federal policies and regulations should really be considered sort of the baseline requirements of what you're doing, and your organization might want and need to have more stringent rules on top of those sort of baseline level. But absolutely make sure you're following the baseline level. There was we posted a little snippet here about PSU researchers maybe violating the federal law using the data of thousands of Portland area K-12 students. So I'm guessing they had a data sharing agreement to get access to those data, but then when they sort of used it and reported it, maybe they weren't in compliance with that the sharing agreement. On the next slide, data access is another sort of aspect of the not only internally within your own organization, like who should have access to what, but again, if you're partnering with organizations, making sure you're thinking through the access piece. Maybe like if you are working with a partner organization and they've collected the data and then they're sending it to you, you have a data use agreement in place that maybe spells out that only one person in your organization can have sort of access to the individual de-identified information. And if anyone is going to sort of do an analysis or sort of look at outcomes of those data, like that one point person will have to de-identify or anonymize the data before they're evaluated further. And that access, you might have to put that in place at the technology layer where like that person has access, at whatever. if you have a database, the person has access at the database level. And then really thinking through again, like in the data use life cycle, the data life cycle, thinking through like what happens when that person leaves and who's going to come in and maintain it, or what happens when the project ends and you shouldn't have access to the data anymore. How are you going to sunset both the access and dispose of the data? Um, so the the big considerations when you're thinking through data access is really emphasizing sort of data privacy. And one of the main ways that one of the things that can sort of result in not having poor data access rules and regulations ties into the next slide, which is about data security and risk management. So this is probably the thing that most of us think of when we think of data governance, is all those headlines in the story in the newspaper, or all the things you get in the mail saying your data was breached. Makes you feel really safe, but they are, definitely risks that we're all aware of. Is like sort of the malicious people who are stealing data from other folks and then holding it hostage. But also, there are sometimes like super accidental, very unintentional disclosures of data that happen, like if you accidentally include the wrong person on an email. So this is where you probably will want to really confer with your IT folks, making sure that you have the appropriate safeguards in place. Some of the safeguards are going to be more administrative, like the everything we just talked about, making sure that you have established standards and policies and procedures, what you do, in the instance of um, and then also making sure that the staff are well trained, and even signing like attestations that they've read the compliance policies. um, then the technical piece is really where the IT folks will come into play if you have them, where it's more about sort of the hardware, the devices, the software you're using, um, things that sort of mitigate the risk to being, having data stolen from the technology itself. And that can look like maybe you've started having two-factor authentication where you have to sign in twice, and it's a bit of a pain. Trust me, I know. But it really does help protect that device in case the device is stolen or lost. And then there's also physical safeguards that you want to make sure that you have in place, and this is really as relates to the space that you're in, or the systems. So making sure that if you have a home office, for example, like the papers that you have are secured in a locked drawer or a locked file cabinet, even if you have especially if you have a shared office, making sure that the papers are locked in a secure file cabinet, locked file cabinet. And that's true of like surveys and other like client notes, anything that has that personal data on it that could otherwise be used for harm if it's taken. And that's also true for like if you're ever recording on a tape recorder. Do we have those anymore? I don't know. Maybe it's all done on phones now, but whatever. I'm making sure that those devices are locked. So there's a lot, as we've all mentioned, there's a lot of resources in the rest of the slide deck that you can go through at your convenience when we send the slide deck out. But as one final activity for us to engage in, we're going to talk about we're gonna have a scenario presented, and then just go ahead and tell me what you think about which aspect of data governance this scenario falls under. So, partner organization we've been working with would like to access some of our own data. That's related to populations we both serve. We don't have a data use agreement in place with the partner organization yet. So what aspects of data governance does this fall under? Again, feel free to pop it in the chat or come off mute if you want to share your thoughts out loud. Cool, all of the above. That was not an option, but is a super legit answer. So data access. Gotta vote for any others. Yeah, data sharing regulations. Yeah, so as at the outside of this section, we talked about how, we were presenting each of these topics sort of individually, but they do all sort of go hand in hand. So I think any answer is probably right. We have another scenario that is dealing with a data breach at your organization where the identifiable health information was taken. Thankfully, your organization has processes in place to notify the impacted individuals. So what aspect of data governance does this fall under? I think in the sake of time, we can probably, data security and risk management, yes, very much so. We can probably go to the next one. It's the end of a project with two partners. Partner A asks for identifiable individual level data from partner B. However, the data use agreement states all cross-partner data must be shared aggregate rather than individual. One is this falling under? Hopefully it got spelled out, policies and procedures. Hopefully it also got spelled out in the data sharing regulations. It's hard to know if you don't explicitly state it in the data sharing regulation. It would probably go up to like whatever your organization's policy is, but you really want to think those through when you're working with partners. Okay. Thank you. I think that, oh, yeah, okay, cool. That is everything that we have today. We are going to keep stick around for another half an hour for folks who want to hang out and ask us specific questions. This is something we're trying new. See how it goes. See if any of you decide to stick around, have time for it. But if you can't, or if you want to, we're also doing a data exchange on November 2nd from 2 to 3. We're going to invite you all to join us in that space to talk about some of your own experiences and give you all opportunities to learn from each other about the data practices and the data principles and the data life cycle and the data governance that you all are engaging with. So join us there if you can. Stick around.